Thank you all for joining us today. My name is Max and I work for a senior level SEND recruitment partner who specialise in placing high level SEND staff into local authority teams across the UK. The purpose of today has been created by myself and my colleague Miles, who is also on the call. We both wanted to create a positive online platform for senior SEND staff such as yourselves, just to share ideas, advice and challenges that are found within the SEND sector, and also explore where certain SEND teams' needs are likely to be given the current climate that we're in. We're really pleased and excited to announce that Professor Adam Boddison is our first guest speaker. So if you do have any questions throughout, please feel free just to chuck them in the chat box function, and we'll get them over to Adam with a bit of a Q&A session at the end. So yeah, without any more delay, over to you, Adam.
Thank you very much. Just bear with me a second while I just share my screen. Isn't that right? Can everybody see that? Okay. Yeah. Good. And what I will also do before I plow on is just make sure that I can see the chat box. So in case sometimes things come in during the session as well. So I will try and keep an eye on that. So thanks very much for inviting me today. I've been given the fairly broad title of looking at the kind of pressures and challenges around SEND in local authorities. I should kind of start with a kind of admission that I've never actually worked in a senior role in a local authority. So I say this from a point of view of being a slight outsider, but equally, I hope that gives me a kind of neutral perspective, if you like, to look at this with a kind of overall SEN lens and look at some of the pressures that we see in different parts of the country, and also how some local authorities have overcome them in some quite innovative ways as well. I'll be drawing on various bits of evidence as we go through, and it's going to be quite a data-heavy session today. One thing I know from lots of my colleagues that I meet in local authorities is that they do like the data, so I've tried to provide plenty of that. At the end of the session, I will share the slides as well with the colleagues at Panoramic, so I'm presuming they'll be able to be passed on in some way. As I go through, I've got the chat box in front of me, so please feel free to post questions as we go through, and I'll try and pick those up as we go through. Equally, there might be some things that I don't get to, and again, feel free to repeat those at the end, and I'm happy to answer those. My plan's to talk for probably about 40 to 45 minutes, which leaves us a good kind of 15, 20 minutes or so at the end for questions. So again, there'll be plenty of time for that. Just introduce myself as well, if you don't know me. I'm Chief Executive at Nasen, which is the National Association for Special Educational Needs. That's a membership organisation. So if you're not a member, why not? It's going to be free from January, so that's a good time to sign up. I also chair something called the Whole School SEND Consortium, which is a government-funded initiative which provides a lot of free resources, not just for schools around SEN, but also for local authorities, multi-academy trusts. There's some stuff there aimed at governors, teachers, all different aspects of the SEND workforce. I'm going to come to that a bit later on and show you where all those resources are hosted, because there may well be things in there which are worth looking at, which would allow you to review SEND at a kind of local level and to get a good insight into that if you're not aware of those already. I've put Twitter handles on there as well, both for myself and for Nasen. Feel free to tweet at me during the session as well, or if you come up with a golden question afterwards that you wish you'd asked during the session, it may well be other people want to know the answer too, so feel free to tweet at me after the session as well. But all polite things though, please. Not that I forget any rude things, but you know, it's interesting times. Okay, so let's crack on. So first thing is, I mentioned the free membership. If you do want to take advantage of that, it's the Nasen website, nasen.org.uk/membership, and as I say, free from January. Okay, well, look, let's start off by thinking about the context in which we're currently operating, because I think we already know that there are significant budget pressures on local areas, and some of that is to do with things which are nothing to do with SEND necessarily. They're to do with things like social care and adult services and so on. But actually, the pressure that's on even young people's services is quite significant. Now, this is a report, this graph is taken from a report published by the National Audit Office in 2019. And it was a report looking at send spend. And this particular graph looks at every local authority in the country and looks at what proportion of those authorities, or what number of them I should say, have overspent on the high needs funding block. So the numbers in red, if you like, above the line are the numbers of authorities that have overspent, and the ones in blue below the line are those that have underspent. And you can see if we go back as far as 2013-14 academic year, you can see it was reasonably evenly split, as what you might expect. But then you can see every year post the SEND reforms coming in, that pressure really ramping up on the high needs funding block. And the latest data we've got here is for 2017-18. I haven't seen any data beyond this, but my hunch would be probably every local authority in the country, if not very close to that, is likely to be overspending on their high needs funding block. Certainly there's a lot of authorities I go into where they're having conversations with Schools Forum about having to top slice the DSG, so the main funding block for schools, to try and top up the high needs funding block as well. So there are some real challenges there. Now, I don't put this up here just as a criticism in any way. I share this really just to set the context in which you're operating, and to acknowledge, I suppose, that you know, it might be easy to kind of come up with solutions, but actually some of those solutions do cost money, and I think that there is not enough money in the system at the moment to actually make SEND provision effective. I would also say that some of the money that is in the system is not necessarily being spent as effectively as it could be as well. So there's kind of two elements to that, and I'll touch on both as we go through. Okay. So moving on, just a bit of the kind of census data, I suppose. So every January, and you'll know this, all the schools in your areas complete the national census. And as part of that, they share data not just on the type of need, the primary area of need of pupils in the schools, but also on the volume and complexity of need. And I think it's worth just looking at how it's changed over time. So this blue line at the top here is looking at the overall proportion of students with SEND in the school system. So we can see back in 2007, we had about 19% there of pupils that would have had SEN. And that's all pupils with SEN in the system. That peaks in 2010. If you're wondering what happened in 2010, or the three kind of big things happened at once that made this start to fall. The first thing is there was a change of government, which brought with it lots of change of education policy. The second thing was an Ofsted report that was published, which was called "The Statement Is Not Enough," which essentially said, schools, we think you are over-identifying the number of pupils with SEND. And then there was also, the third thing was a change in the funding mechanism. So up until that point, the way it worked was that the more pupils you had with SEND, the more funding that schools would get. And at this point it changed, and we got this thing, the SEN notional budget, which we could probably have a big debate about whether that's a real thing or not, but we probably won't get drawn into that now. Anyway, this resulted in the proportion of students with SEND dropping, and you see it drops again in 2014 when the Children and Families Act comes in, and then from 2016 onwards it's gradually started to creep up. Now, the other two lines on this graph, the green one here is what would have been School Action Plus, and now SEN support, so the non-statutory end of SEN. And the orange line at the bottom here is those that would have had statements and now education, health and care plans. Now, the reason I show all of these together is that you can see that the overall change in the profile of SEND has largely been at this non-statutory end, so that what is now the SEN support end. And I suppose one of my pleas to you, if you're in a position in the local authority where you can really influence SEND provision and what it looks like, is to really think about the fact that 80% of pupils with SEND are actually at that SEN support level, and 20% of them are at the more complex end with an education, health and care plan. And often what I see when I go into, and this is schools as well as local areas, is actually a lot of attention is focused on the statutory end because of the legal ramifications and the complexity and everything else, but actually actually the proportion of pupils is not the same. Interestingly, when you look at those with the kind of statutory end here, it was 2.8% for about a decade, and then it started to creep up. And this is where we've seen massive pressure over the last few years on high needs funding blocks, and it's now around just under 3.5%, which is quite significant. A couple of questions coming in. So is this data for all schools with SEN, or is it just mainstream or independent? It's for all schools, this one. So it does cover the independent schools as well. And there is a breakdown as well. Now I'll talk through in a minute where you can get this data if that's helpful, because it's published every July on the DFE website. And in fact, if you actually just Google SEN data DFE or something like that, there's actually a page where DFE have collated all of the data sets that relate to SEN that are in the public domain, and that includes exclusions, attendance, outcomes, census data. There's a whole range of things in there which might be useful. And Adam, does the orange line include only those under 16? It covers up to 18, so it doesn't cover the 18 to 25 age range. So I know some people, when I show them this, will say, yeah, but the increase, and because I've got, sorry, the next slide, some people will say the increase here, when you look at the raw numbers, is due to the fact that the provision was expanded in 2014 to cover 0 to 25, and so that's kind of been factored in, if you like, to this graph. Okay, the reason I show the raw data here as well as the proportions is that, of course, all of these changes that I was talking about before have happened in the context of a growing overall pupil population. So actually, a 1% increase is more significant every time it happens in that sense. So again, you'll be familiar with this, I'm sure, but it's useful to know, because my sense is that whilst this has happened and there are more pupils with SEN, more complex needs, a greater volume of needs, in general, the resource that's available to support needs hasn't really grown at the same pace. And in some places, it's actually shrunk. So that there are real pressures there, I think. Okay, I've got some questions here. I'm not expecting you to answer these questions. They're kind of hypothetical questions to think about. And these kind of work at a local area level. You could equally ask them at a multi-academy trust level or even at individual school level. And there's a reason why I'm asking these, which I'll go on to. So the first one for you to reflect on is, if I asked you to name the 4 broad areas of need from the SEN Code of Practice, could you, I suspect that because you're all at this webinar today and you're interested in SEN, probably means you could. But I suspect there are lots of your colleagues, perhaps in other parts of the authority, who maybe have responsibility for different areas. So thinking of funding, for example, where actually they would see their job as being primarily not to do with SEN, so they don't need to worry about that. And my argument is, I think anybody who perhaps has a role where it might influence on SEN ought to know the 4 broad areas of need. Why do I say that? Because if we don't, it means that the strategic decisions that are being made on things like, it could be capital investment, it could be on policy decisions at the local area, then what happens is they're made thinking about youngsters with SEN as one homogenous group. Now that's not a moral kind of judgment, it's an operational judgment, in the sense that if you knew, for example, that 40% of the needs in your local area were speech language communication needs, then actually that might influence, when you're making decisions about capital spend, what kind of new build school you might have, because it might be you need a specific provision for speech language communication, or it could be social, emotional, mental health needs, for example. So I think it's quite useful. So we're not expecting everybody to be an expert in SEN, that would be unrealistic, but actually I think it is a reasonable expectation to say that most people in senior roles in the local authority probably ought to know what the 4 broad areas of need are, and to be having that in their thinking as they make the kind of really important decisions about the education system as a whole, which will impact obviously on those pupils as well. And that kind of links in with the second one, really, which is about the most prevalent primary areas of need. And I'm going to come on to a specific example of how you might use that in a second. and you might want to nuance that by looking at the kind of primary schools, secondary schools, and specialist provisions that you've got in a slightly different way, because they're obviously quite different. A really interesting thing to look at if you're interested in looking at data around primary areas of need is if you look at the proportion of children with speech language communication needs in year 6 and in year 7. Something happens over the summer holiday, I think, that lots of these speech language communication needs seem to disappear. But equally, the proportion of pupils with social, emotional, mental health needs that weren't there in year 6 suddenly appear in year 7. Now, again, I don't say that to make a particular judgment on anything, but I think it's interesting that you see this transfer of one type of need to another, and that might be something you think about. How do we strategically address that in terms of transition across the area? Okay, I shall move on. Oh, a couple of questions. Yeah, so I agree with the comments there. They're not really questions, they're just add into the argument, which is helpful, and add into the debate. So I've talked about this census data. Now, every school will have their census data. Now, in some areas, that census data is submitted directly to government. In some areas, it's still done via the local authority, as it used to be. Whichever way it's done, it would be worth you as the local authority getting hold of that census data at school level. It is actually available in the public domain as well, but it's a bit awkward to get to. Now, the reason I say that is that you've obviously got all of that individual school level data. The regional data you will then have, and the LA data. Yeah, the LA data by need, it's that same data set I was talking about before, which is on the DFE website. If for whatever reason you can't find that, I think it's Sally who's asking, then please drop me an email afterwards or tweet at me and I'll send you the link so you can go directly to it. But it's available for every year for the past 10 years, so you can even look at trends over time as well, although probably anything older than 3 years ago is probably less useful. What I've got here on the screen is the real data for Blackpool and for England from, I think it's 2018 or 2019, I can't remember which one. And then I've invented a school, which is this Lady Vedetta High School. I've just made that one up and I've made some data up. Now, it's quite useful, I think, to look at the data in terms of the distribution of need nationally, regionally, and then by school if necessary. Now, the reason I say this, it's not to say that it should be the same, because very good reasons why it might not be the same, but where it's different, it might lead you to ask some really interesting questions. So, for example, on this graph here, I'm looking and I can see that nationally, autism is at a much higher proportion nationally identified than in the regional area here and in this particular local school. Now, that could be because the area is really, really good at meeting the needs of youngsters with autism, and so therefore the needs don't get identified as SEN, so they don't go on the register, and so it's disproportionate. Equally, it could be that there's a major under-identification of autism needs there, that actually it's missing, and it could suggest there's an issue around identification. So you can see the data doesn't tell the whole story, but I think it does lead you to ask the right questions. And especially if you're looking at this across a local area and you see that actually across lots of schools, you see that there's a kind of broadly similar pattern, and one or two schools with anomalous data, then it might lead you to ask questions about how inclusive that school may be. So is it that, for example, there is some exclusion at the point of admission where you might have a school leader saying, yes, there's a school up the road that would really be really good at meeting the needs of that child. Or equally, I call them send magnets, the schools that are really inclusive and they get a great reputation for being inclusive, and every parent wants to send their children to that school, and then they get overwhelmed with need. So it's really worth looking at. A couple of comments in the chat coming in about the accuracy of identification and ASC potentially being seen as SEMH. Yeah, absolutely agree with that. And also things like attachment are not actually included in the census, and how that's recorded. That could be SMH or autism. And someone's posted the link as well. So thank you for doing that. That's helpful. What else might you look at on here? You might look at, for example, social, emotional, mental health needs. And you can see they're particularly high for this school, certainly higher than the local area and very much higher than the national average. So you might say, well, why is that? Is there a larger proportion of children with social, emotional, mental health needs locally because we're failing to meet needs in other areas, which are then translating into SEMH needs over time because of unmet needs, for example? So, so there are some challenges. A couple of particular ones to look out for: moderate learning difficulties. Now, there is actually a proper definition of moderate learning difficulties, but it's one of those areas that sometimes is used as a bit of a catch-all. Not always, but sometimes. So if you see that it's particularly high, like it is in this one, that might suggest that the accuracy of identification isn't as good as it should be in that school, and they're just being classed as having moderate learning difficulties in a kind of generic way, rather than something more specific. So you can see specific learning difficulties as particularly low. So instead of saying it's ADHD or dyslexia, actually say, well, it's just general learning difficulties. And I want to say something about the top one as well: SEN support but no specialist assessment of type of need. So that's one to look out for as well if it's particularly high, and I'll explain why on my next slide. So this graph here, this is taken from the Edward Timpson review into exclusions, school exclusions. So it's a couple of years old now, 2018 this was published. And this is one of the graphs in there, which is not really used very often, but actually quite useful for the point I'm about to make. So this is an odds ratio graph. It looks quite complicated, but don't be worried. The key thing we need to look out for here is the horizontal black bar that goes across here, and that's at number 1. And what this graph is looking at is saying, how much more likely are you to be permanently excluded if you have a particular type of SEN compared to having no SEN? So, for example, if I look at something like behavioural, emotional and social difficulties here, and I'm looking at the blue bar, and it looks like it's about number 6 there, that means you're 6 times more likely to be excluded if you've got behavioural, emotional and social difficulties than if you had no SEN at all. Now, why do I show this graph? I show this because, and I'm particularly looking here at those who are in the SEN support group. So they've got SEN, but they haven't got statements of that non-statutory end, again, the plea I was making earlier on. So if you look at the big 4 here, behavioural, emotional, social difficulties, social, emotional, mental health difficulties. Okay, you might expect those 2 to be in there as most likely to be permanently excluded. But look at the other 2, SEN type not recorded and no specialist assessment. So what that tells me is there is a direct line from failing to accurately identify need right through to permanent exclusion. So if in your area, one of the challenges that you're facing is exclusions which are on the rise, or you're struggling to get them down any lower than they are, a good place to go back and have a look at would be actually, how many pupils have we got in our schools that where the SEN type is not recorded or there's no specialist assessment? Because there is a direct causal link here, or certainly a correlation, if not a causal link. And actually getting that, if you think about it like this in a logical way, if you haven't identified the needs, how can the needs possibly be met? And if the needs aren't met, then that results in behaviours which are likely to result in exclusion from school. Okay. No questions at this stage. Good. Right, I shall carry on. One thing that you'll probably look at is attendance and exclusions data. And I've just put here 5 questions that, and again, not to answer now particularly, but just to think about asking across the area. And you see it links in with what I was saying earlier on about the kind of 4 broad areas of need and the different types of need. Medical needs, I think, will be a particular concern at the moment, just because of obviously the health concerns that and challenges that obviously we're all facing at the moment. But those with complex health needs, obviously, a particular cohort to be looked at. And it's that question 4, which links back to that last slide, that if we've got exclusions which are not because of persistent disruptive behaviour particularly, but because actually we've not adequately put the provision in place in the first place, then that's kind of on us, if you like, rather than on the young person. And so we've got an obligation to go back and I think morally have a look at that. Anyway, you'll get the slides so you can look at those at your leisure, but I thought that was useful to share, because these are also the kind of questions, if you're holding school leaders to account, that you may wish to ask them in terms of making sure you're confident with the provision across the area. This is another graph, and you'll be pleased to know this is the last graph I'm going to show for a while, because otherwise it'll be a very data heavy session. This is the last graph I'm going to show from the National Audit Office report, and it looks at secondary school outcomes in terms of Progress 8 scores. And the reason I wanted to show this is it shows that across the 3 years, which was from 2015 to 2018, that Progress 8 went up every year across the country for children without SEND. But for children with SEND, and that's all children with SEND, regardless of whether it was an education, health and care plan that they had, or whether they were at SEN support, progress levels have gone down. And well, this says two things to me. One, it says there's a problem with the Progress 8 system, because if it's so heavily weighted towards academic outcomes that it doesn't properly take into account some of the wider notion of outcomes we might want to look at. But also, I think it puts a challenge back to the local authority level and to school leadership level about, okay, well, if this progress measure isn't the right one, how can we be sure that the pupils in our schools with SEN are achieving the right level of outcomes, and we don't just kind of hide behind, well, you know, national progress isn't great for this cohort. And in particular, I would just point out that of the primary areas of need I showed before, not all of them are cognitive needs. So for a lot of pupils with SEND, we should still expect the academic outcomes for them to be as good as those without SEND. And that was what I wanted to explore for this next bit of the session, because a lot of schools ask me how they can do that with the data. And I wanted to just unpack some of that a bit more. So someone's asked me a question here, which is identify a primary and a secondary need to therefore make a better fit. Yeah, I agree with that. Yeah, I think that's a fair point. So I've been looking very much at just primary need here. When you look at the data online, it does give you secondary need as well. And actually that complexity of need is very important. So that's a really good point from Anna there. And someone's asked about, is reverting back to value added a better way of doing it? Well, I'm not convinced about that, but I do have a possible alternative, which I'm going to come on to now, Robert, which hopefully will answer your question. So what I've got here, and I've just used a primary school example for this, but you can do something equivalent for secondary schools. I wanted to mix up kind of, because I wasn't sure whether we'd have some people here who are just looking at primary or secondary, so I want to have a mix of things for the session. This, I think, is very typical for the kind of thing that you might get at a school level. Okay, so it might be reported to the Board of Governors, for example, and you will have an aggregated version of this, no doubt, at local authority level. And this is where, you know, we're looking at key stage 2 outcomes, and we're looking at expected progress in reading, writing and maths and the combined data, and in higher standard and greater depth for those things as well. And what we do is we get the data for the whole school and we compare it against the national average. And for this particular school, we might see, oh, actually, they're not doing very well compared with the national average. Oh, apart from reading higher standard looks quite good. But in fact, the higher standard generally looks okay. I'm not so sure about maths, but actually, in general, the expected level isn't being met. And if I was in a governor's meeting for something like this, I also know what would come next, which would be, oh yeah, but when I separate out the students with SEND and without SEND, you can see that our students without SEND, they're doing really well. Look, way above the national average. So it's these students with SEND who are letting us down. But, you know, we wouldn't expect them to do any better than that, would we? And this is the point where I think we need to think differently, because this is the Progress 8 trap as well, which is where we kind of almost hide behind the outcome data for pupils with SEND to let us off the hook, if you like. So one of the things I do is I suggest that when we look at all those primary areas of need, and as I said before, only 3 of those, and it's these 3, profound and multiple learning difficulties, severe learning difficulties, and moderate learning difficulties, they are the only ones which are actually cognitive needs here. Now, we might argue about some of the others, but, you know, in broad terms, these 3. So what I suggest is that instead of just having non-SEND, you actually break it down by those with non-cognitive primary areas of need and those with cognitive areas of need. And to again, the point around primary and secondary area of need, you might factor that in as well here. But the point is this: for those with non-cognitive SEND needs, you would expect this group here in this penultimate column, their academic outcomes. There is no reason why, for example, someone with a vision impairment or a physical disability, there's no reason why their academic outcomes shouldn't be as good as those people without those types of needs. That's an accessibility issue rather than a learning issue. So again, that gives some nuance to the conversation. I think allows you to really kind of probe a bit more to some of those conversations you might be having with school leaders. The obvious next question then is, well, what about these with the cognitive SEND needs? Is this okay? You know, 10% compared with 75% over here? I mean, doesn't look okay. What's acceptable? If we've kind of said, well, we don't expect them to make the same level of academic progress necessarily, how do we know what's good enough? And so my question there is that, well, my answer is that there are two kind of elements to accountability for this group. One is an academic one, and I would tend to be led by both the family and the school as to what academic success looks like in that area. But also it's that broader notion of outcomes. And so one of the things you might do is split that group up into those who've got education, health and care plans, and those who have cognitive SEND needs who don't have education, health and care plans. And my suggestion is that you might reintroduce individual education plans, blast from the past there for people who remember those. Now, why do I suggest that? Because an interesting measure, and it's not perfect, but it's an interesting one, is to look at the proportion of pupils that have met the targets that are specified in those plans. Because they're broad, because some of those are about academic outcomes, but often are about lots of other things as well. And because the way, if they're done properly, they should be co-produced. So the family's been involved with those, multi-agency professionals, the schools and so on. Actually, it should be quite a holistic measure of whether or not those pupils are achieving or not. And you can see in this example I've given here, it looks like actually for those with EHC plans, they're doing it, actually quite a lot of them are doing okay, but maybe not enough attention for those who are perhaps on the cusp here, who've got cognitive needs, but not serious enough to warrant an EHC plan. Yeah, and someone said about progress from starting points. Yeah, absolutely agree with that. Absolutely. Okay, other potential metrics you might want to look at across the area. So stakeholder views, I'm sure you've got lots of that data already that you collect. Rates of attendance and participation, and this is more a school level one, that one. One thing that's often not looked at, people often look at complaints that come in, and they might even look at the complaints and say, well, what proportion of them are to do with SEND, and just look at how that's changing over time to see if that's getting any better or worse. People don't often look at the compliments that come in, and my sense is there are lots of people often working really hard in local areas to do a really good job. And they will often receive emails from families or phone calls, really pleased with what's been done. Very rarely is that kind of formally recorded, and actually balancing that against the kind of complaints and looking at those two things together is not just good in terms of knowing where your good practice is, but actually getting a sense of proportion of those things. Another question I think coming here from Gary. Separating our cognitive and non-cognitive needs should enable a SENCO to lead a whole school focus on targeting provision while also maintaining high expectations. Yeah, I agree with that. And that will be more active engagement with families. Yeah, absolutely, 100% agree with that comment in the chapter. And the last thing, and this is, if you're ever doing any kind of surveys of teachers right across the authority, really interesting thing to do. One of the things you might ask them, really straightforward question, is, do you feel confident in meeting the needs of pupils with SEND? And you might do that on a scale, or you might do it as a simple yes, no. It's quite interesting. It doesn't tell you whether they are meeting the needs or not, but it tells you about the confidence of your workforce at scale. And actually looking at how that changes over time is interesting. I should say, by the way, that sometimes I've been with authorities and they've done this, and then they go, right, we've got an issue here because teachers aren't aren't very confident. Only 50% are confident. And so they put some provision, some support in place, some training in CPD, and then confidence goes down and they go, oh no, it's not worked. But actually sometimes it's, you put some provision in place and then the teachers realize how much more they didn't know. So it can go down before it goes up, and that's okay. So you just have to take that confidence measure with a bit of a pinch of salt, but it is one that's useful. The other one, when you're doing stakeholder views, by the way, particularly for children themselves, and particularly for the older children, less easy for the younger children, is just to ask them the question, do you feel included in your school? Again, yes or no. You don't need to get into why or why not, but that is just a single metric, and to look at how that's changing over time will give you a sense at a local authority level of whether actually there are, things are going in the right direction or not, and also to be able to target whereabout it might not be going in the right direction. Now, there might be some very good local reasons why it's not or why it is, but again, it's a useful thing to know. Okay, how are we doing for time? Okay, we're doing okay. We've got about 10 minutes. Okay, good. Right, I want to just touch on some topical matters. I've not really mentioned the pandemic word today, but I venture into that space now because that will be a key pressure that's on all of you at the moment. And I'm going to talk about that a little bit on this slide. But just ahead of that, we obviously had the spending review yesterday, which looked at kind of looked at funding for this next year. It's interesting. There were some things in that spending review around SEND and new money for SEND, particularly in high needs, the high needs funding block. One of the things I've pushed for is for the high needs funding block to be wiped clean and written off in every area. In the way that they did for the NHS budgets at the beginning of the pandemic. Now, the reason for that is because what I see is new money announced for the high needs funding block very rarely makes it all the way through to the kind of end user. And again, that's not a criticism. That's because often there are existing gaps in funding that have to be plugged where local authorities have made commitments. I get that. So, you're in a difficult position. So my argument to government is that if they wipe that clean, it gives you a chance to kind of look afresh at how you effectively spend the money rather than having to kind of go back and fill all the gaps first. But there is a comprehensive spending review coming next year, which will set out funding priorities for the next 3 years. And that comprehensive spending review is happening at the same time that the SEND review will eventually publish. And in fact, the SEND review, I think, will come slightly ahead. Now, that's, I think, promising because, as I said earlier on, I think it's not just that there's not enough money in the system, but we're not necessarily spending the money on the right things. And that's a national issue as much as anything else. So the fact that those are happening at the same time, I think, brings with it a level of opportunity to really look root and branch at some of the kind of funding mechanisms that we've got in place. In particular, for example, thinking about the way in which special schools are funded compared to mainstream schools. Actually, the kind of ought not to be a difference. So if you're a pupil with a particular level of need, it shouldn't really matter what provision you go to. Now, we could get into a big debate about ordinarily available provision here, but I'll try and avoid that. But if you think about it, what my view would be that we need to think of the schools not necessarily on the kind of dichotomy of it's special or it's mainstream necessarily, but more as one continuum of provision, because I've met some special schools which operate almost as mainstream schools, and vice versa, some mainstream schools which have such excellent specialist provision, they're practically special schools. But depending on the categorization determines the funding model, and that can often hamstring them in terms of things they want to do. And points being made here about the high needs funding currently being based on a kind of arbitrary formula. Yeah, absolutely, is a bit of a postcode lottery at the moment. Someone asking about, do I have an update on the SEND review? Well, obviously it got delayed because of COVID. The words that ministers are using at the moment are to do with, so I think the exact word is elongated. The SEND review is elongated. It's a ministerial word for you. So as I understand it, it's likely to be published in the summer term. I think it probably will go to ministers before then, but obviously there's a lot of sign-off processes and so on. What I'm less clear on with the SEND review is how radical or not it may be. And for me, if it's a review that only looks at the education aspect of SEND, it's probably not going to be very radical because it won't be able to be. It needs to be quite holistic in terms of looking at health, social care, but also other departments like Department of Work and Pensions, because actually there's no point the school's doing a great job and then they go into the workforce and they're not properly supported by DWP, for example. So there are, it needs to be much broader, and that would require a much more radical change. So, I don't know any more than that at this stage. Obviously, in terms of return to school, we hear a lot about pupil needs and pupil SCMH needs, but there's a lot of teacher anxiety out there as well. And if you're not doing it already, I'd encourage you to think about what you might be able to do at a local level to kind of support teacher anxiety. Support teachers who are experiencing anxiety, I should say. So the pupil SCMH needs, this is really interesting. There was already a very significant number of pupils with social, emotional, mental health needs, particularly at secondary school. One of the things that we're seeing from our Nasen members is that is now the top priority in special schools, in primary schools, in alternative provisions, and in secondary schools post kind of the summer period, so in this kind of autumn term. So in my mind, if that much of a priority at school level, this should be absolutely a big concern at local authority level, and there should be a kind of local authority-wide strategy on this area. And this is pupils who've had either an extended period of time away from school and therefore struggling to reintegrate, or the opposite, where actually they've really got on well with the kind of remote learning offer and therefore don't want to come back. And there is an argument actually that because that blended learning approach for some pupils has actually enabled them to better access the curriculum, that could now be seen as a reasonable adjustment under the Equality Act. Now, that's not been tested in a kind of legal sense yet, but if that was proved to be true and people started requesting that, there are some real challenges down the line for how the school system responds to that, because I just don't think it's equipped to respond to that, certainly not at scale at the moment. So it's just one thing to think about. And as I say, because of this anxiety of pupils and teachers, there is this risk that we haven't seen a spike in exclusions yet, but that there could be a honeymoon period and that could come. Another point in the chat here about mainstream can learn a lot from specialist and vice versa. Yes, I agree with that. And that's one of the reasons why I often think local authorities and multi-academy trusts are both uniquely positioned to kind of leverage expertise both ways on that. It happens really well, actually, in some places. I've seen that work really well. The other thing you'll probably have seen is this spike in elective home education. Now, this was going up anyway. I understand there's no requirement to keep kind of registers or anything like that of those who are electively home educating. It might be worth thinking about that, at least for the short term, because there may well be a number of pupils who are doing this, not because it's a lifestyle choice at the moment, but because of other fears that I've written down here, or just because it suits them in the short term while parents are working at home, for example. But actually, you might see next September a huge re-entry of people back into schools, and you probably want to be ready for that before it happens. So yeah, right. A couple of resources I wanted to flag. So I said earlier on I'd flag where some of the whole school SEND resources are. You can get them from this place here, the SEND Gateway, so sendgateway.org.uk, and there's a tab on there called Whole School SEND, and you can find it's an Aladdin's cave of resources in there. And one of the things, some of the resources you'll get are here on the screen, and these were produced specifically in response to COVID. They're all free. And actually, quite a lot of these resources are also available as kind of white label versions, so editable Word documents. So you can download them, add in the bits maybe from your local strategic plans, which maybe aren't in there at the moment, take out the bits which aren't relevant. You can put your own logo on and brand it as whatever you want. So use it as you will. If you are going to use it, it'd be really helpful for me, because this was funded by government, if you could tell me that you've done it. just because it allows me to go back to government and say, thank you for paying for this. Look, it's been used by these local authorities. Didn't you do a great job? Can we have some more money to create more resources, please? So that would really help me. So if you are using it, please do let me know. So the top left one here is a review guide that, and it's really at school level one, but it could easily be adapted for LA level to look at and reflect on how prepared you are in terms of meeting the needs with SEND in the context of COVID-19. The top right one is around the kind of SEMH side of things, and it's looking at the kind of trauma-informed return to school. We didn't use that language because I think that puts a lot of people off because they think it's something quite different to what we're talking about. But it's really about pupils, an increased number of those with SEMH coming back into schools, and actually how do we make sure that we are both nurturing those needs but also doing it in a way that's safe. The two Ask, Listen, Do leaflets in the middle, they were created in partnership with NHS England and with families. And these are leaflets which are for families to help them ask the right questions of schools to make sure that schools have done the right things around return to school, but also to give families confidence that schools have done the right things as well. So it structures a useful conversation. And there's a particular resource there around adopted children as well, which may well be something that's on your radar. Last few slides, I'll be relatively quick on these. I chair something called the National SEND Reference Group, and it looks at the very more specialist end of the sector, so those with complex needs. And these are just some of the things that have come up. I've talked about some of them already. So notions of vulnerability, you probably have picked up at the beginning of the pandemic, there was quite a blunt use of vulnerable children. And I think I did, if some of you are directors of children's services here, you will have had a letter from me at some point talking about different types of vulnerable. So are they financially vulnerable? We've seen the one that's used a lot in the guidance, clinically extremely vulnerable, for example. So I just think about vulnerability in a more nuanced way, if you're not already doing that. Talk about medical needs. I've learned more about aerosol generating procedures in the last 5 months than probably I'd care to know in my entire life. But this is obviously a group of pupils, particularly those with tracheostomies and so on, who are particularly at risk from COVID. Now, the guidance on this has just been updated last week. If you're not aware of that, it's on the DFE website. And Public Health England, actually, it might be Public Health England website. So well worth having a look at that because it's a lot more pragmatic, I think, than some of the previous versions. And if you don't know what fogging machines are, it's genius. These things are amazing. So this is what a lot of settings have invested in, to be able to deep clean their settings regularly, particularly special settings, because they've got a lot of furniture which is kind of soft furnishings and things which are not so easy to clean, and it effectively kind of puts a spray out, it gets into all of the nooks and crannies and actually cleans in quite an effective way. I think I've talked about those other things already. Last thing I just wanted to mention to you is something that Nasen offers, which is called the SEND Casework Award. So all of you will have casework teams in your areas. So we offer a level 3 and level 4 accredited qualification, and we're currently offering it online, which is for SEND caseworkers, and it allows them to look at the kind of legal and technical, interpersonal and communication aspect of the role, because it's quite a complex role, really, and you've often got some quite relatively junior members of staff actually in quite a pivotal position in terms of trying to coordinate all the therapists and pediatric specialists, trying to coordinate the teachers in schools, families. So actually it talks about how do they do that in a really effective way. And it's kind of an on-the-job qualification done over kind of 9 to 12 months. And it's kind of supervised locally within the authority. There are kind of 4 workshops across the year, and there's a portfolio that they put together. A lot of local authorities are taking advantage of this. So if it's not happening in your authority and you want to know more, then I'd absolutely encourage you to do that. There's some testimonials here, which you can look at in your own time. And this is a picture of my daughter as well, getting very excited in a shoe shop. That's just to cheer me up and tell me that we're near the end of the presentation. But if you want to know more about the Casework Award, on the Nasen website, nasen.org.uk/casework, Send Casework, you can find more there. And last slide, a quick plug for my new book, which is coming out, which is the Governance Handbook for Send and Inclusion. It's coming out, I think it comes out on Christmas Eve, actually. So it's maybe a nice Christmas present. So do have a look at that. It covers some of the principles I've covered today. It's pitched very much to governors of schools and trustees of multi-academy trusts, but actually the principles in there apply to leadership of groups of schools in general, so they may well be relevant. And lastly, just in terms of CPD, Nasen does have a great webinar series that you might want to think about as well, and you can find information about that on the Nasen website. Right, okay, so that was my 45 minutes. Here's my email address if you did want to kind of contact me about anything afterwards, or you can't find any links or anything I've talked about. Similarly, again, please do follow me on Twitter if you're not already. It'd be good to pick up the conversation in an ongoing period. And I do tweet out a lot of resources and materials which are not necessarily Nasen ones, but from across the sector. And as I say, news and updates when I get them as well. So I will stop sharing my screen because we might want to have some questions. And I'm hoping that was useful. And there may well be lots of things in there that you knew already, but I always judge these things on if people are taking away even one thing that they're going to do differently as a result of today that they wouldn't have done otherwise, then for me that's a success, because I multiply by that by all the people in the room and then by the number of children that one thing might impact. And I think that's a good way to spend an hour probably.
Thank you very much, Adam. Just wanted to say, thank you for that. We're going to finish the webinar with a Q&A section. So I haven't run this past Adam yet, but I think the best way to do it is, Adam, if you've still got, if you're still able to access the chat function, if we give people 1 or 2 minutes to put their questions in, and maybe you can pick a few off till 1 o'clock. How does that sound? The best way to go?
Very happy to do that. In fact, there are some questions already, so I'm quite happy to pick some up in here.
So please, if you've got any questions, feel free to put them in the chat box. I'll wait for you to type them out, and then hopefully Adam can answer a few before you all go.
So lots of people, I think, contributing to the discussion rather than questions. So I'll just pick up on a couple of the points in the discussion first. So lots of people talking about the kind of will to be inclusive. I didn't really talk about that a lot in the presentation itself, but it's interesting. One of the real challenges around being inclusive is deciding what that actually means. And there is still, I think, if I was to ask 10 people, what does inclusion in schools mean? I'd probably get 10 different answers, maybe more than 10 different answers from the same 10 people. So for some people, they say that's very much about the type of school that you go to. Is it mainstream or special? I think it's quite an outdated view now, probably. For some people, it's not about the place, it's about the process, and it's about whether pupils feel included, and that's more important than what you actually do. And the reality is that what's inclusive practice in one school might not be inclusive in another school. So it's kind of quite a fluid idea. Right, so a few questions coming in here. So I approach inclusion sometimes from a staff wellbeing perspective with both young people and parents. I think the idea that that young people are at the beginning of that conversation and families are at the start of that conversation is absolutely right. So I didn't talk a lot about co-production today, but it seems to me that the lack of co-production is often at the root of a lot of issues. And sometimes the things that are going to make a real difference to families and children being happy and satisfied with the service they get isn't necessarily just the quality of the service, it's the communication and the input that they had to making some of those decisions from the outset, and some of those things don't cost any money. Sometimes it can be the phone call from the school that regularly keeps the parents updated and vice versa. That actually is far more effective than the expensive one-to-one or something like that. So it depends what it is. But I agree with Gary on that one. When do you think we'll have a revised code of practice? A good question. My hunch would be that, and it's just a hunch, I don't know anything, I haven't got any inside information, but following the SEND review, if it makes radical changes, and I think it might, then that will inevitably lead to a revised code of practice. There are certainly some issues with the current code of practice in terms of inconsistencies between chapters. So, for example, some of the things it says in the early years chapter don't correspond with some of the things about early years that are not in the early years chapter. So there are some issues there that would need to be updated anyway. So someone asking about the 300 million for SEND school places announced yesterday. Is it likely to drive the national inclusion agenda and children and people's right to a mainstream education? It's interesting, isn't it? Because I think there's a reference there to the United Nations convention, which is to do with everybody being entitled to have a mainstream school place. And it's really interesting because when I talk to a lot of parents, yes, there are lots who want a mainstream education who don't believe that mainstream is good enough, so they settle for special. But equally, there are some parents who actually want the specialist input and actually don't want the mainstream. So it's one of these things where you've got a kind of ideology, if you like, around mainstream education for every child, but it's not necessarily what every young person or their families want. And so it's quite a delicate one to balance, I think. But in terms of the question around the 300 million, what I'd like to see is more fluid provision being drawn from that. So actually, if someone is in a special school, for example, does that mean they need to be in a special school 100% of the time, 5 days a week? Or actually, is it that they need to be in a special school for certain elements of their education, but for other elements that they actually might be able to access mainstream education, and vice versa? There might be some youngsters who are in mainstream education who could benefit with a bit of the specialist input that we've got in the special end of the sector. So I'd like to see more fluid provision rather than saying it's more special school places or something like that explicitly. Is there any guidance anywhere or a recommendation about the level of administrative support needed by a SENCO? Yes, there is. So I was involved in 2 studies, both of which are available on the Bath Spa University website. They're national SENCO surveys. So if you do a Google search for National SENCO Survey Bath Spa University, you'll find it. They're both on the same page. And in there, we surveyed over, the first one was about 2,000 SENCOs, the second one was about 1,000. And it talks about the level of admin support. And it talks about the fact that SENCOs are spending too much of their time on paperwork and that they should have admin support or an assistant SENCO, because otherwise, if your SENCO is spending lots of their time on paperwork and not enough time on improving the high quality and inclusive teaching and learning, then what you've got is a very expensive administrator. So it's probably actually cheaper, believe it or not, to actually get an administrator involved. Top tips for mainstream primaries to support transition to mainstream secondary, or is there a publication? Yeah, there are lots of things written around transition and SEND. If you look on the Nasen website and on the Gateway, you'll find some of those resources, particularly under the whole school SEND section. One thing in particular I would look at is that there's an area on the SEND Gateway where it's got a list of 10 videos, which are actually for newly qualified teachers, but I think they're useful for all teachers really, and they introduce lots of different specific conditions like dyslexia, dyscalculia, Down syndrome, and so on. And they're only 10-minute videos, right? So they won't tell you everything you need to know, but they give a really good starting point. So as part of that transition process, that would be quite a good thing, making sure that that primaries could say, actually, I've got somebody with this particular type of need. They might flag that up to their secondary colleagues and so on. All right, there's lots of questions coming in now, and I've got like 1 minute to go. So let's see if I can pick one more. Any teacher SEN conference questionnaire resources available from Nasen? That one I'm not sure about actually, but I can take that one away and come back. Do you think the SEND review will address the disparity of costs between different settings, particularly high costs of places in independent special schools? I believe that the remit of the SEND review does cover funding. Now, whether that means they'll make any recommendations to change the current system, we'll see. In my view, it needs to change. So I hope it does. But as I say, I probably know as much as you on that one. Right, it's 1 o'clock, so I think I should probably stop, because even I don't want to listen to me for more than an hour. So you must be
all day, Adam. I'm sure we could all say here and all day. But look, thank you very much again. Massive thank you. I know you've got a really busy schedule. Really appreciate you taking some time out to speak to us today. And thank you for everyone that has attended the first webinar in our Send and Inclusion series. We will be hopefully holding another one in January. Haven't got the date confirmed yet, so keep an eye out on our LinkedIn and our emails. From that, please feel free to contact us with any topics or challenges that you're facing. This is for you. So we would like it to be anything that you're finding prevalent in Send at the moment. We will get, there is a recording of this webinar, and we'll get Adam to send us his slides so we can share those with anyone. Equally, it has his email. So if you didn't get your question answered, I'm sure he'll be happy to answer it another time. And just from us, a massive thank you for joining in. That was really informative and thoroughly enjoyable. We hope to see you all again soon.